Welcome to the haunting room, where fear and mystery await. Turn off the lights, grab your courage, and prepare yourself for stories that will leave you trembling. Enter if you dare. What you hear next might just haunt you forever. Now, let's dive into today's terrifying tales. It was late November, and I was driving home from a friend's cabin in the woods. The route took me along a dark, winding road through a remote stretch of forest. There were no other cars around, no streetlights, just the narrow beam of my headlights slicing through the blackness. I'd been driving for about half an hour when I saw a shape on the side of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was a car, an old sedan with the hood up and a single figure standing beside it. He was waving me down, looking frantic. I don't usually stop for strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere, but something about the way he was waving, so desperate, made me pull over. I rolled down my window just enough to speak. "You need help?" I asked, glancing over him quickly. He looked like he was in his 30s, with messy hair and dark eyes that seemed to dart around nervously. "Oh, thank God," he said, exhaling in relief. "My car broke down. I've been here for hours." He asked if I had a phone he could borrow. Reluctantly, I handed him my cell, watching as he dialed a number and held the phone to his ear. But then he just stood there, staring at me, not saying anything. I shifted uncomfortably. "Did you get through?" He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on me, his face tense. Slowly, he lowered the phone and handed it back. I noticed his hand was shaking. "No signal," he mumbled, almost too softly to hear. An uneasy feeling crept up my spine. Something didn't feel right. I forced a polite smile and reached for the gear shift. "Well, I hope you get help soon. I should get going." But before I could drive away, he stepped closer, leaning against the car door, his hand gripping the edge of my window. I was starting to panic. "Could you give me a ride to the next town?" he asked, his voice low and pleading. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but everything in me was screaming to get away. "I'm sorry, I'm really in a hurry. I'm sure someone will come along soon." His grip on the door tightened and his eyes seemed to darken. "Please, just a short drive. I'm freezing out here." I swallowed, my heart pounding. "I really can't." He stared at me for a long moment, his face expressionless. Then, finally, he let go of my door and took a step back. "Fine," he muttered, his voice hollow. "Fine. I guess I'll just wait here." I didn't waste any more time. I rolled up the window, put the car in gear, and pulled back onto the road. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, watching him fade into my rearview mirror. I had just started to relax when I saw something in my peripheral vision. In the dim glow of my headlights, I saw another figure standing just off the road, partially hidden in the trees. They were watching me, motionless. A chill ran down my spine. My gut told me it was no coincidence. As I sped up, my mind raced with possibilities. What if the man hadn't been stranded? What if he was part of something? What if he'd planned to get me out of the car? Or worse. I kept driving, glancing in my mirrors. I wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and that stretch of road. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the glow of lights ahead. A gas station. I pulled in, breathing a sigh of relief as I parked under the bright lights by the pumps. I got out of the car, needing a moment to gather myself. I stepped inside the gas station, nodding at the clerk behind the counter. I could see him watching me with mild curiosity as I tried to calm down, to shake off the encounter. "Rough night?" he asked, half choking. "Yeah, you could say that," I muttered, forcing a smile. I grabbed a coffee and headed back outside, but as I rounded the corner to get back to my car, my heart stopped. There, by the side of my car, stood the man from the road, watching me with those same dark eyes. He was just standing there, smiling this time, a slow, unsettling smile. I didn't even think. I turned and bolted back into the gas station, slamming the door behind me. "Hey," the clerk shouted. "What's going on?" He's outside," I stammered, pointing to my car. "The guy from the road." The clerk grabbed a bat from behind the counter and went to the door. But when he looked outside, the lot was empty. No one by my car, no one anywhere. He looked at me, confused. "There's no one out there, but I know what I saw." He'd been there, standing just feet away, watching me, waiting. And even though the clerk didn't see him, I knew that man was still out there, somewhere in the dark, watching. When I was 22, I rented a cheap studio apartment in Chicago. It wasn't fancy, but it had what I needed: a roof, a bed, and a small kitchen. The building was old, though, with creaky floors and odd drafts. The landlord warned me that the previous tenant had left in a hurry, but I didn't think much of it. People move on. One night, about a month after I moved in, I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard a faint tapping. It wasn't rhythmic like dripping water. It was sporadic, almost purposeful. It was coming from the wall by the bed. At first, I thought it might be the pipes, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, it stopped. A few seconds later, it started again. 3 soft taps, then silence. I knocked back out of annoyance. Almost immediately, 3 taps responded. I froze. The tapping became more erratic, like someone was trying to claw through the wall. I backed away, my heart pounding. Then it stopped completely. The silence was worse than the noise. The next day, I told the landlord. He laughed it off and said the building had quirks, but he agreed to check it out. Later, he called to tell me there was nothing unusual behind the wall, just wiring and insulation. That night, I went to bed with the lights on. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something dragging across the floor. It was faint, but it was definitely coming from inside the apartment. I didn't dare move, but my eyes darted around the room. Then I saw it. The closet door was slightly ajar. I always kept it closed. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the closet. The door creaked open wider. I swear I saw a hand, pale, bony, slide back into the darkness. I bolted out of the apartment and didn't stop running until I reached the all-night diner down the street. I stayed there until sunrise. The next day, I told the landlord I was moving out. He didn't fight me on it. As I was packing my things, I decided to peek behind the wall where I'd first heard the tapping. I pulled a bit of the plaster loose and found something I'll never forget. There were deep scratch marks on the wooden beams, like someone or something had been trying to dig its way out. I never went back to that building. Sometimes I wonder what happened to the previous tenant. Other times, I think it's better not to know. I used to live alone in a small apartment on the ground floor of an old building. It wasn't in the nicest area, but it was close to work, and the rent was cheap. I'd come home late one night after a long shift, too tired to do much of anything. I threw my bag on the couch, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed into bed, not even bothering to change out of my work clothes. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a knock at my door. It was soft, almost hesitant. I glanced at the clock, groggy, and tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. But then, a few seconds later, another knock, louder this time. I got up and peeked through the peephole. Outside, I could make out a figure standing in the dim glow of the hallway light. It was a man, tall and skinny, with a hood pulled low over his face. He looked almost like he was swaying slightly. I was immediately on edge. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, trying to sound firm. The man didn't answer. He just stood there, breathing heavily. I could hear it, even through the door. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "I think I have the wrong apartment," he mumbled, sounding disoriented. But he didn't move. He just kept standing there. His face turned toward the peephole, like he was watching me watch him. "Okay, well, you should go," I said, keeping my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. I heard him shuffle a bit, but he didn't leave. He just lingered there, mumbling something I couldn't quite make out. Then, suddenly, he stopped mumbling and knocked again, this time harder. I backed away from the door and picked up my phone to call the building manager. But right as I dialed the number, I heard a metallic scraping sound. I froze, listening. It was coming from my doorknob. He was fiddling with it, trying to force it open. My heart was in my throat. I shouted, "I'm calling the police," and I heard him laugh. It wasn't a deep, menacing laugh. It was quiet and nervous, almost like he was laughing at a joke only he understood. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could to my bedroom, where I locked the door and climbed into the closet, heart racing. I called 911, whispering to the operator, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The operator reassured me, saying they'd send someone immediately. Then I heard it, the sound of my front door creaking open. I clasped a hand over my mouth to keep from making any noise. Footsteps creaked in the entryway, slow and deliberate. He was in my apartment. I could hear him moving around, opening drawers, rustling through my things. Then he stopped. For a long moment, everything was silent. I held my breath, wondering if he'd left. But then, in a voice so soft I could barely hear it, he said, "I know you're here." I couldn't help it. A tiny gasp escaped. The footsteps moved down the hall, closer to my bedroom. I could hear him testing the door, trying the handle, rattling it. I squeezed myself further into the closet, my body rigid with terror. Suddenly, there were loud knocks on my front door. The police. The footsteps stopped. I heard him dart down the hallway, and a few seconds later, the sound of my bedroom window being shoved open. I stayed hidden, too terrified to move, until I finally heard the officers calling out for me. When I opened the closet door, I could barely stand. They checked the entire apartment, but he was already gone. The officers found a small knife on my bed, along with a crumpled piece of paper. Scrawled on it in shaky handwriting were the words, "I'll be back soon." I never saw him again, but that night haunted me. For months, I kept every light on, every door locked tight. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that one day I'll wake up in the middle of the night and he'll be there, tapping on my door, just waiting for me to let him in. About 2 years ago, I took a job as a caretaker for a remote mountain lodge. The lodge was huge, a beautiful place surrounded by miles of dense forest, but it only operated during the peak season. In the winter months, it was completely isolated, only accessible by a rough, winding road that got snowed in most of the season. My job was simple: keep the place clean, make sure the pipes didn't freeze, and ensure that everything would be in good shape when the tourists returned in the spring. In exchange, I had free room and board, complete solitude, and all the time I could want to work on my writing. It seemed perfect. For the first few weeks, it was. I'd spend my days wandering through the empty lodge, dusting, straightening things up, and making notes about anything that needed repairs. At night, I'd sit by the huge fireplace in the lounge, tapping away at my laptop, the wind howling through the trees outside. Then one night, I started to hear things. It was around midnight, and I was about to go to bed when I heard footsteps upstairs. They were faint but unmistakable, creaking slowly across the ceiling. I froze, listening, wondering if maybe a bird or raccoon had gotten in somehow. But the footsteps kept going, steady and human. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs, heart pounding. But when I got there, the place was empty, every door locked, every room silent. I tried to tell myself it was just the old building settling, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next few nights were quiet, and I started to relax, thinking I'd let my imagination get the best of me. Then one evening, I was in the basement, checking on the furnace, when I found something that stopped me cold. It was a notebook, old with a cracked leather cover. I opened it, and what I saw made my skin crawl. On the first page, in neat handwriting, someone had written, "Caretaker's log." But it wasn't the official logbook we kept for the lodge. It was personal. Each entry was dated, going back decades. All the entries had a strange, repetitive quality, with lines like, "Saw him again today, just at the edge of the woods. He knows I'm here. He watches. Woke up last night to footsteps outside my door. I'm not alone here." The entries continued, each one more frantic than the last, until they just stopped. The last entry was dated 10 years ago. I tried to tell myself it was just an old caretaker's way of passing the time, maybe a story he'd written to scare the next guy who took the job. But that night, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't just above me. They were right outside my bedroom door. I lay there in the dark, my heart racing, listening as the footsteps stopped just inches from where I was lying. I could feel someone, or something, standing there just beyond the thin wood of the door. I didn't sleep a wink that night. In the morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things, threw them in my car, and drove down the mountain. I didn't care if the snow was getting heavy, I just wanted to get out. But when I reached the bottom of the hill, the road was blocked. A huge tree had fallen across the path, cutting off my only way out. I turned back, heart pounding, and saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, standing in the snow at the edge of the trees. His face was shadowed, but I could tell he was watching me. I reversed, my hands shaking, and sped back up the hill to the lodge. I locked every door, barricaded myself in the main room, and waited for the sun to go down, too scared to move. That night, I heard him again, his footsteps pacing slowly outside, around the building, Every so often, they'd stop at a window, and I'd see his face staring in, watching me with an unsettling calm. I don't remember much after that. I think I must have passed out from exhaustion or fear, because when I woke up, it was daylight. Everything was silent. I checked all the doors, all the windows, but he was gone. In the spring, when the new caretaker arrived to take my place, I warned him. I tried to tell him what I'd experienced, but he just laughed it off. I don't blame him. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't lived it. But before I left him something. I tucked the old caretaker's log into the top drawer of his nightstand so that when the footsteps started, he'd know he wasn't alone. When I was a teenager, my family moved into an old farmhouse in a small town in Indiana. It wasn't much to look at. Paint peeling from the siding, warped wooden floors. But it was what we could afford. From the first night, strange things began happening. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room, but when I opened the door, no one was there. My parents brushed it off as the house settling. One night, as I was falling asleep, I heard soft humming. It sounded like a lullaby, but it was off-key, almost mechanical. I froze, thinking maybe it was my mom. I crept out of bed and followed the sound down the stairs to the living room. The room was empty, but the humming was louder, coming from behind the large old mirror that hung above the fireplace. I stared at the mirror for a long time, my skin prickling. Then, in the faint moonlight, I saw something move. Not a reflection, something behind the glass, a shadow, faint but unmistakable. The next morning, I asked my dad about the mirror. He said it had been there when we moved in and he thought it was bolted to the wall. Curious, I tried to pry it loose that afternoon, but couldn't. There was a small gap at the bottom, though, just enough to see that the wall behind it wasn't solid, it was hollow. That night, I woke up to a loud thud. My heart racing, I crept downstairs and found the mirror lying face down on the floor, the glass intact, but smeared with what looked like handprints. We called a contractor the next day to check out the wall behind the mirror. When he cut into it, we discovered a small hidden space. Inside was a dusty rocking chair, an old doll with a cracked porcelain face, and a bundle of letters written in a spidery script. The contractor left quickly, muttering something about bad vibes. My mom burned the doll and the letters in the fireplace that night. The humming stopped after that, but the mirror, I swear, some nights, even after we moved out, I can still see faint shapes in any reflective surface. I never hang mirrors in my house anymore. And sometimes when the house is quiet, I still hear that off-key lullaby. Thank you for joining us in the Haunting Room for another collection of spine-chilling tales. If you enjoyed the stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next terrifying episode. The darkness is always closer than it seems, and we'll be here waiting. Until next time, stay haunted or not.